Hello. Hi, students. This is my follow-up mini lecture on our discussion of the context of environmental law. And I have a few slides that I've prepared. So without spending much more time, since I do want to keep this short, let's just go right to the slides. Okay. So I will make these slides available on Camino as well. But there are really three topics that I want to touch on. One is societal context of environmental law. That's a topic that we already discussed in our first class on Monday, and especially the broader situatedness of environmental law in contemporary issues like the racial and social justice protests. And then also two additional topics of economic context and ecological context. We've already started on economic context with respect to the tragedy of the commons as an example, a model for how behavior and real life influences effects on the environment as modeled by the tragedy of the commons. And what we didn't get to is how regulation might have to respond. And as part of that, really how economists provide useful models for thinking about these issues. The third topic here of ecological context we didn't get to at all, and that's really I'm hoping to cover in terms of contemporary understanding of the environment and ecology, how those have affected both our understanding and also shaped how we regulate environmental issues. Right. So let me just move on here just first to the brief recap here of societal context. And we did already discuss this broader issue of the social and racial justice protest, especially I think as it's manifested in one broad movement that affects the environment, and that is the environmental justice movement. One sort of outcome of our discussion that we've already touched on is that in many respects, social and racial justice issues and also environmental justice really a part of the fabric of values and norms in which law and regulation are situated, right? You simply can't take those away. They're just part of what our legal system relies on and finds a justification in terms of its operation and its importance. But the difficult question that arises, given that there's so many other values and priorities that exist in our society, how important, where should racial and social justice issues, for example, fit in? It's really this broader challenge of prioritizing and making choices. And I think one of the responses that we touched on that I thought was very insightful was that, in fact, government and society can and should address more than one issue at a time. It's not necessarily always an either or. And one other way to describe it is that sometimes suggesting that environmental justice or racial and social justice issues are less important, or there are other things that have to be done first, is that presents a false choice. A false choice in the sense that society can and should do more than one thing at a time, and that in fact more than one thing is important for us to have a good society and for us to lead a good life. Right? So that is sort of what we had touched on before. Let me go on to the economic context here. And that is, in particular, the tragedy of the commons that we touched on. Tragedy of the commons as an example, as a model or metaphor of this broader problem of free access common pool resources. Right? That is part of the reading, and also the externalities that the tragedy of the commons generates, or that come oftentimes with free access common pool resources. Why do they rise? Primarily because they're public goods. Right? An open access common pool resource like a free, open grazing ground leads to overuse. It's a public good because everybody can access it, and therefore it also cannot prevent free riders or those who take advantage of this free access, and end up enabling or promoting overuse, right? This idea that the private interest or the individual self-interest may not promote and may in fact be directly contrary to the common interest or may harm the common interest. What we also touched on in our discussion was that, in fact, the tragedy of the commons, even though it's a very valuable metaphor, a model for the problem of environmental protection, it is also actually quite limited and inadequate in describing real life, right? In fact, there are many other considerations and drivers of behavior, including the power of community norms, of community customs, lots of informal incentives, and lots of other ways in which behavior can be shaped and by which overuse or free riding can be curbed. That is sort of one of the limitations of Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons. But beyond that, beyond those limitations, there of course have been really valuable insights gained from that. And a lot of regulation and economic approaches to addressing environmental problems have come directly out of addressing sort of these free rider issues and disincentives that are created. Now, I do want to point out that economic models of environmental issues have been incredibly important in environmental law and regulation. In fact, they've become a incredibly visible analytical tool in any type of regulation, right? So just as a heads up, even if you don't end up studying or practicing environmental law, if you engage in any other practice of related to federal agencies or regulation, it really behooves you to become familiar with cost-benefit analysis and economic analysis tools, because cost-benefit analysis pervades administrative law and pervades how the Office of Management and Budget in the White House thinks about what is proper regulation or not. It pervades the work of federal agencies and how courts actually view what is appropriate regulation and how to balance the various interests, right? So you will see it a lot, not just in environmental law, but all over. And part of what economic analysis allows us to do is provide essentially numbers to trade-offs that the government has to engage in, between the cost and the benefit of engaging in particular action. But that also leads to a real important problem or tension that this analytical approach presents, and that is how to price things that are generally intangible or unquantifiable, right? This is the discussion that is also in the book. How do you value pristine landscapes, endangered species that we don't necessarily use, but we just enjoy seeing, or we just feel that there's value in their existence, right? Those are very difficult to quantify. Or for that matter, how do we quantify the value of a life or good health or all those other things that that we don't usually buy and sell. And that is actually one of the fundamental challenges, because if you cannot put a number or dollar value on it, it's very difficult to incorporate it into cost-benefit analysis. And in that way, economic analysis has really been criticized as being detrimental to effective or good stewardship of the environment, because it tends to undervalue how we think about the environment and the value that it has to humanity, to communities, and to society. At the same time, I think the reading also points out that economists, especially ecological economists, have been making great strides in doing exactly that. Not in quantifying necessarily the unquantifiable, but trying to address or put a dollar value on things that are traditionally not or very difficult to quantify. There's the example in the Jim Salzman article about the water purification services that forests and natural areas provide, and the example of New York City choosing to buy up for $1.5 billion and preserve landscape instead of not worrying about forest degradation, and instead simply building a water purification plant at $4 to $6 billion in cost, right? No question, hands down, much cheaper to preserve the landscape at a lower dollar cost, and you probably actually will achieve much, much more as a result. Right, so ecosystem services as an analog to values or services that can be provided in the marketplace, and therefore as a way of putting a price tag on what nature is actually worth, right? Again, that probably is going to undervalue it, but at least we're taking steps to get closer to that, right? So that is also the importance here of economic analysis, both its pervasiveness in environmental regulation, as an impediment here to getting proper environmental protection that ensures that we protect what we value. But at the same time, methodologies being developed to do just that. Now, the last slide here that I have is about the ecological context. Part of what the reading provides is a perspective of the environment that has become more important and better understood. Sort of ecological perspectives, the Aldo Leopold Sand County Almanac perspective. The proverb that you've heard, I'm sure, that is quote unquote, everything is connected to everything else, essentially that the environment is interconnected. And another sort of proverb or adage here that humans are in fact part of nature, that we're not really a part or above. And that, I think, has implications about how we think about our role and what we can or should do to nature, how we should protect nature, and what we shouldn't do. But I think it also complicates things in that part of what comes later at the bottom of my slide, that in fact, if we're part of nature, maybe our alterations, our changes of nature are just part of the process of change, right? So, as I said, it complicates things. There are a couple of things here that are also important to be aware of, and that is increasing or better understanding of ecosystems, of ecology, has also shown us that things that change in the environment is not necessarily linear, that there are synergistic effects, that two influences can have a much greater influence than just an additive effect, that 1 + 1 is not necessarily 2, but 1 + 1 can maybe sometimes be 5 or even 10, right? That's actually quite really important insight of ecology, that the unintended consequences that we may not be aware of for quite some time, climate change, some of the biological diversity issues are good examples of that, how they affect the ecosystem adversely, the loss of species. And then finally, also scale issues. At some point, influences or adverse effects on the environment will have, as I said, these kinds of unintended consequences will have disproportionate adverse effect when you've suddenly crossed a threshold and you've gone over the carrying capacity, the ability of an ecosystem to repair itself, to renew itself, and then suddenly you fall off a cliff and the ecosystem breaks down and the consequences sort of suddenly bound out of proportion. Finally, an important item here to just be aware of is, as part of the evolving understanding of ecology or of nature, is the idea of the balance of nature, or homeostasis. Right? That used to be the prevailing perspective, that somehow nature was always in balance. It turns out that that actually has never been true, that nature is constantly changing, or that maybe a better way to put it is nature is in a form of dynamic change, that little influences can alter how ecological systems function, and that we kind of have to be more comfortable with it, that there isn't sort of a natural state in which the ecology ecosystem exists, and that everything always influences is in a state of flux. It does affect how we can effectively protect the environment, but as I said, it also influences how we might think about our own role. Right? So these are sort of three broader takeaways. Society, environmental laws embedded in society, and we should think of societal values as one other factor that influence how we think about the law, environmental law. Economic is an important tool for shaping environmental law, and ecology, again, should provide us with additional values that go into why environmental law is worth implementing. but they also present, I think, challenges, right, with respect to social context, issues of choice and priority, what we do first. Do we address distributional issues first, or do we address simply cleaning up across the country, generally for most everybody else, for example, pollution issues? Economic issues, the problem of valuation and pricing, that has been a real challenge. And ecological context, this idea of homeostasis and a balance of nature, that it's not so simple to get back to what, quote unquote, nature used to be before human intervention, because there really isn't, I think, a time when humans, at least that we can sort of practically go back to where humans really weren't part of nature and that we can, quote unquote, restore, right? So these three contexts, finally, I want to point out, are actually encompassed or embodied in this broader idea or concept of sustainability, the role of society, of human development, of economic development, of ecological values. Those are all broadly embodied within that. We don't need to worry about that broader concept at this point, but what I want you to take away of this is these additional perspectives are important, and they form really a set of considerations that go into especially promulgating regulations where Congress has provided an agency quite a bit of discretion in shaping particular rules as part of implementing a broad congressional statutory mandate. Right? I'm going to end here, but look for a quiz that I'm going to put together to help you learn and remember some of the terms and concepts that are touched on in this reading.